Welcome back to the Law School Toolbox podcast. Today, we're excited to have ex-BigLaw recruiter Sadie Jones here with us to talk about the basics of lateraling. Your Law School Toolbox hosts are Alison Monahan, and typically I'm with Lee Burgess. We're here to demystify the law school and early legal career experience so that you'll be the best law student and lawyer you can be. Together, we're the co-creators of the Law School Toolbox, the Bar Exam Toolbox, and the career-related website Career Dicta. I also run the Girls Guide to Law School. If you enjoy the show, please leave a review or rating on your favorite listening app. And if you have any questions, don't hesitate to reach out to us. You can always reach us via the contact form on lawschooltoolbox.com, and we would love to hear from you. With that, let's get started. Welcome back to the Law School Toolbox podcast. Today, we're excited to have ex-BigLaw recruiter Sadie Jones back with us to talk about the basics of lateraling, or what other industries might refer to as finding a new job that's not your first job. So welcome, Sadie.
Thanks for having me back.
My pleasure. Well, to start us off, what does the legal industry mean by lateraling? Is this something only within BigLaw, or are people leaving BigLaw? Like, what does this even mean? I mean, and why is there even a word for it?
So I would say it's really anything that you're switching jobs from your first job to, another job. So once you have your job out of law school, then anything after that is a lateral move. And it just means that you have some kind of legal experience before you've moved. So it could be kind of anywhere in your career. And as long as you've already had one job out of law school, and it could be anywhere. So I think the term may be more common in BigLaw, and it's kind of, you're referring to specific, people with certain kind of experience, but I would consider, a lateral move anything at all to any job.
Right. And here we're not really talking about a clerkship. We're kind of talking about that first, real job after you clerk, if you clerk straight out of school.
Exactly. I consider that more like kind of a tag on to school, I'd say.
Right.
So it would be, after the job, after your clerkship.
Right. Well, assuming someone starts off as a law firm associate, because I think you're right, this is probably most commonly used in that context, is where people will probably hear it. When do they typically start looking at lateral options?
Well, I don't know if I could say there's an exact typical, but generally, year 3, year 4, I would say, a lot of people are starting to move. There's going to be the outliers that maybe only have a year of experience and move. Either something went wrong, maybe they move with a partner, that's at the firm that's moving. But usually around year 3 or 4, you're sort of either going to stay on partner track and you're going to try to make it, if we're talking about BigLaw, or you're looking at other options.
Right. That's what I've always heard, that by the time you're sort of a third year, you should definitely be thinking about this. And what are some of the options that people are typically looking at?
I would say, it's probably different whether you're transactional or litigation, but some things, are the same. So in-house is obviously a popular option, and
let me stop you there. What does that even mean for people who are like, that sounds great? What in-house? Like I'm going home? Like I'm working from home? Like what are we talking about?
Good question. So to back up, in-house means working for a company. So basically you're on the client side. So if you're at a law firm, you're being hired by the in-house attorneys at a company to help them with their legal issues. And so it would be like you're on the client side.
Right. I just wanted to clarify that because sometimes we throw these terms around and people probably have no idea what we're talking about. And what a lot of people don't realize is, a lot of law firms, they're working for companies, but a lot of these companies also have in-house counsel. So there are certain things that they do fairly routinely. And then the less routine stuff, like, they get sued by someone and they need to go to trial or whatever it is, they'll actually hire the outside law firm. So, depending on the type of work you do, you might actually work directly with clients or with lawyers in your client's business. And so it's kind of an interesting mix. And so, you mentioned a minute ago, like your options may vary depending on if you're a litigation person or a transactional person. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Sure. So I would say that, in-house might be particularly popular for transactional attorneys. There are a lot of in-house options versus if you're a litigator, you may have more like a wider variety of options. So you may look at government work. There may be other things outside of that. I would say that transactional, it's sort of an easier transition to be in-house. So that's kind of maybe where I would draw the distinction. But there are litigators, obviously, in-house, like you said, who are working on, if you get sued, if you're going to go to trial, that kind of thing.
Yeah, and I think more and more, like a lot of tech companies have a large in-house staff of people who used to be litigators working on things like antitrust stuff and privacy things that they don't necessarily want to fully outsource. So I think certainly the reputation has always been that it's much easier to go in-house on the transactional side, but I think that might be shifting at least somewhat.
Definitely. And something that's kind of interesting about the in-house option is, you may go and work for one of your clients on the other side. And I think there might be sort of a misconception if you don't know much about this process, like that a law firm would feel like, oh, you're leaving us, you're quitting, you're going to work somewhere else. But it's actually great. And law firms love that. And then they have like one of their own inside.
Right.
So you have your relationships at the law firm. And so they're hoping that you're going to continue to give them business. So it's like a really good thing and looked on positively.
Right, because law firms expect that most people are going to leave.
And they need you to leave.
Right, they need that. That is the business model, actually. Like they can't really have people sticking around. So a class of 100 people, a handful, if that, of those people might make partner. So all these other people are going to disperse, and depending on the firm, I mean, some of them really support their alumni and whatnot, and like really keep them close. Other ones don't so much, but it's always a good thing. Like you said, I'm thinking like when we would go down to pitch business at a tech company or something for a case we were looking to get onto, people are like waving to their old associates in the hallway. It's like, get the special thumbs up. Obviously like you had an inside line on that work as an outside firm.
Definitely. And where I think that kind of law students and junior associates sometimes miss the boat on these things is that they're not thinking about this when they start or from the beginning. And so like a situation that can be difficult is that you get past the third or fourth year and you sort of think you might be making partner or think you're going for that, and that's not really going to happen for you. And so you can get past this point where it can sometimes be harder to lateral, especially if you want to go in-house or you want a certain kind of position and, it's almost like you're too experienced for what you'd be able to get. So I would just tell everybody to really sort of think about what, your strategy might be. And you don't need to know this right away going into it, but I would definitely be thinking about that in year 2.
Yeah, I mean, I've kind of heard that, you're most marketable for things like in-house positions between like year 3 and year 6 or so. Do you think that's around accurate?
Absolutely. I think year 7, year 8, it gets a lot harder.
Yeah, because I think people start thinking like, oh, what's going on here? Like, are they just kind of stuck? Did they think they were up for partner and then they got passed over? Like, why are they getting passed over? I just think it becomes harder. And this isn't, I mean, depending on the firm, they may have like people to talk to you about this sort of thing, but I think a lot of firms just kind of leave you to your own devices, and suddenly people who've just had their heads down working for 6 or 7 years look up and it's like, oh, what happened? Like, where did my options go?
Absolutely. And also, sometimes you need to take a hint, which is like they may be counseling you into doing this sort of thing. So you should listen to that feedback if you're getting it.
Yeah. I mean, how can people figure out like if they really have a shot at making partner or not? Like what kind of signals do firms send?
Not always direct ones, I would say. So some of it may be sort of reading the tea leaves. But I think if there's a partner who's like on your team who's, telling you that they're going to be helping you and pushing you along and they're going to be your mentor and they're going to be your sponsor. So that's like one way to know. Do you have that person? Do you even have anyone like that on your team? If you don't,
Like, you also have to look at, does that person realistically have the power to get this done?
definitely. It's not just like somebody likes you.
Right. You can have people who love you and they're like, yeah, they're great, but you realize like they're a junior partner who doesn't have the ability to actually come into the partner meeting when this is being decided and say, this person is critical to my team. They have to be made partner. Like, nobody's going to listen to them at that point.
Absolutely. I also just think, what's the kind of feedback you're getting? Because usually you're going to get at least one review a year, if not more. And so sometimes they will kind of directly tell you whether, you have a future or what sort of your path is. It depends on the law firm. But I would listen carefully to what that all is.
Right. And I think probably having somebody to work with, on the outside is probably a good idea to kind of bounce these off of. Well, this is what they said. Like, what do you hear there?
Exactly. Because you might be too close to it, and you're just like, well, they liked my work. They said I was doing a good job. But that's not all you need.
Right. And there may be options. I don't want to say they're like exactly lateral, but even within a firm, if you're not going to be a partner, you might be able to be like counsel position. I think people just need to be aware of like what options exist for them and like which of these seem appealing, which of these seem feasible. Because just, thinking that, I'm starting as an associate, my career is set is not really how this works.
I also think that the entire system, especially if we're talking about BigLaw, is sort of confusing and misleading in terms of the salary, because your salary starts so high and continues to go up every single year. And so you hit this point where maybe you expect that. And so to be clear, like the in-house positions are going to pay less. And that's just the way it is. And the government positions and probably like all your other choices are going to pay less.
Definitely your nonprofit positions.
Yeah. But they're going to give you probably a better quality of life and probably more job security in a lot of ways. And you may have more of a sort of a future to move up. And in some companies, there might be stock options. So there are other things that make those jobs appealing. And then in terms of staying at the law firm, those counsel positions are not going to be like partner positions, but they're also going to have less of the business development component attached to them. Again, you may have more job security. So you may feel like you're sort of taking a cut or not moving up, but you need to think about long term. It's just like the system doesn't continue the way it does for that first few years.
Right. And, as with transactional and litigation, there are certain practice areas that are more conducive to having like a counsel position. If you're in a very specialized area that's useful, but not super lucrative for the firm and you're not developing like huge amounts of business out of it, that might be, a very nice life for you, or nice career where you don't have the stresses of being a partner, but you're still making like a decent salary and doing work that, maybe is less stressful and more interesting to you.
Definitely. So I think you really need to look at sort of the bigger picture and how this is all going to work out. And also, however you can, you should be trying to like budget and think about your finances when you're making more towards the beginning. It's something else to think about.
Definitely. I remember the judge I worked for was like, don't take on a huge mortgage when you're working in a law firm because you want to be able to quit when you want to quit.
Exactly. And I also know a lot of people who pay off more of their loans, at the beginning, and then they feel this like, freedom later because they can live off just, a normal salary.
Right. Yeah. People might stay like 5 years at a firm and pay off all of their student loans in that time frame. So I think these are just things to be thinking of rather than kind of drifting into this and being like, cool, I'm set up forever. That's not how this works.
Exactly. And, don't let these things just happen to you. Like you have control over it. You can sort of think ahead about your career and where you want to go and where you want to end up. And like planning for it early is going to be better.
I agree. Well, on that note, once people have been associates for not really very much time, they're probably going to start getting calls from legal recruiters. I mean, do you think these people are worth paying attention to? And when should people start paying attention to them?
This is hard. I have a lot of mixed feelings about this. So I don't think you shouldn't pay attention to them. I think you should be discerning about who you feel comfortable with and you feel you can trust and you feel is telling you the truth. They will sell you on things. They will tell you jobs that don't exist. They will submit your stuff to people that you haven't given them permission to submit your stuff to sometimes. So all of that can happen. I would be careful. I would make sure that everything's in writing, that you've said this is okay. I've seen all sorts of weird things happen. So that's number one. Number two is a firm would always rather not pay a recruiter to hire you. So if you apply directly, they will see your stuff. It doesn't mean anything more that a recruiter sent it to them. The recruiter will tell you that they're giving you something, that they have these relationships, that they're going to get you in the door. That's never been my experience. So applying on a website for a lateral job gets you seen in the exact same way. And if anything, you're, minus $40,000 to $100,000. So that's a positive. And a lot of firms, when they're cutting their budgets, just say that they don't work with recruiters. So I think you just need to think about those things. That being said, I don't think there's anything, wrong with having a conversation.
Right. I mean, I think, someone who's really good at what they do as a recruiter at least has a pulse of what the market's like. I mean, and I think you're right. Like, you've got to be careful. Is this person telling you a realistic assessment of things, or are they just telling you what you want to hear to get your resume? But, I think, people just get inundated with recruiter calls. And I mean, I think you're better off kind of finding one person that you like and just telling everyone else you're already working with someone or whatnot. Because I think you're right. I mean, there are going to be more jobs that are outside of that context necessarily than like within only that context. It doesn't seem like any firm would ever be like, oh, we're only posting this position with a recruiter.
Right, because they're all, they don't really do retained searches with a recruiter where they're only working with that person. So if they tell you that, that's probably not true. Maybe for partners.
I was like, certainly not for like these type of positions about
exactly
4 to 6 years.
It wouldn't make any sense. So, and sometimes they only work with recruiters for people like who are a certain level, where they feel like they need that person to vet them. So I would also look on the website and the job posting, make sure there's a posting that they say they have a job at this place, then it should be posted, and it should say whether they're working with recruiters. So I would even go as far as looking at that. And also it would be a good idea to look on LinkedIn, see if you know anyone who knows that recruiter, like see if somebody else worked with them and can tell you that they liked them.
Right.
I think is always like a good idea.
Right. I think it also could be different if you're actively looking to make a transition versus just kind of passively, your third year. And so now you're kind of thinking about this. If you like definitely need to get a job in a different city or something for personal reasons, like that might be a reason to work with someone in that area.
Definitely. I was going to say, if you're moving cities, then I think it makes a lot of sense and they may know the market better. So, try to find someone that you trust and believe in. I just think there's a misconception that just applying for a job yourself is not going to get you seen, and that's not true.
Right. And you also want to make sure your materials are up to snuff. If you haven't written a resume since you graduated from law school, one way or the other, you probably want to have some work done on that. But, you can do that independently as well.
Yeah. And I would get, maybe a few opinions on the resume. Don't just let the recruiter say like, that's good or, that's it. I would probably, get a few people to look at it and see what they think.
Definitely. Well, on that note, when people are trying to lateral within BigLaw, so, from one firm to another, what is the new firm really looking for?
Well, first of all, they're going to look at all the stuff they looked at when you first came in, is my experience. So they are going to look at what law school you went to. They're going to see your grades. They're still going to look at that. It becomes less important as you get more experience. It's like sort of fades into the background more and more. And it's going to matter more and more what your experience is. So they're going to look at, what firm you were at, what group you were in, what kind of experience you have, have you hit these kind of milestones they expect for your level. They may even look at sort of the partners that you are working with, which may be known, depending on what the practice group is. So your experience is going to be the most important. And they're also going to expect an explanation of why you're leaving. So if you've been at your first job for 6 months, it's going to be hard to explain that.
Well, let's talk about that a little bit. I mean, what are people typically looking for when they decide to transition? Why might somebody want to do this?
What's the real reason, or what's the reason you
Well, I mean, I'm not saying like 6 months in, like obviously there's a problem there. But say, somebody who's been in a firm for 3 years, like what's the point of moving to a different firm?
Right. And sometimes there is no point. So if it's just like, oh, I didn't like this big law firm, I think the other one will be different. I would caution you that big law tends to be sort of similar. So there may be a place where the personalities just don't fit. But, typical reasons are, one, like you're moving cities or something like that. You may want to move to a different group. You may not be getting the experience you want. Maybe they have kind of indicated that you don't have a future there. It may depend on sort of your class size, who the other people were kind of in your class. Some of it's kind of out of your control. But typically I would say they just either want different experience, want, to try something else. And a lot of times people will kind of try, let's say 2 big law firms to see if, again, maybe it's different, to see if like big law is the right move for them. And then if that second one isn't right, they'll make a totally different decision.
Right. And you touched on this earlier. Say somebody's like, okay, I've done 1 or 2 big law jobs. I realize this is probably not like my, path forward. What type of, you mentioned they're probably going to take a salary cut. But, what are the reasons people transition out of big law?
For lifestyle reasons, I think is the first, that they can't keep up with the kind of schedule of big law. And then also just that they're not on the partner track. And so they're not going to make that. And so they need to find something that's going to sustain them long term.
Right. I mean, I think people just have to be realistic here. If you're getting the signals that like partner track is not for you, it's not for most people. So it's not really, something that you need to like feel bad about. But I do think you have to be realistic and not get stuck in that kind of like purgatory of being an 8th year who doesn't have any other job, and like suddenly is scrambling to find something.
Exactly. Just remember that it's a really small percentage of people that are going to make partner in your class. So, that's like most likely not going to happen. And you need to think about what you're going to do for the next 30 years.
Right. And more firms are actually taking lateral partners, which a lot of them used to never do. So there may be that like no one in your incoming class ends up being a partner at this firm because they just hire people from other firms who are already partners. Well, before we run out of time, can you give people some tips for setting yourself up for a successful lateral process, whether you think this is going to be to a different firm or in-house or government or nonprofit? Like, what should people be thinking about in terms of making this successful down the road?
Well, one, always keep your resume updated. So it should constantly be updating as you come up with new things that you need to add to it so that it's available given the right opportunity. And always keep networking and keep that up whether or not you're going to move so that you're not in some kind of rush if you need to. So sort of your relationships, and it might include, getting to know a recruiter, that kind of thing. And then also I just suggest that you have your story straight and you know what you're telling the firm, and in no way are you bad-mouthing where you are. So just keep it positive.
Yeah, one thing someone suggested, which I admit I didn't do, but I later in retrospect wish that I had done, was really any time that you got a new type of assignment, whether that was a case or you did something on that case, you took a deposition, you defended a deposition, you wrote a brief, you did this, you did that. Just to write that down someplace so that then when you need it later, you have it at your fingertips versus trying to think back like, oh, well, 2 years ago at that clerkship, like what exactly did I do? I thought that was really good advice that I wish that I'd followed.
Definitely. And I would specifically make note of anything, that's sort of impressive or, is a big deal, a milestone, that kind of thing.
Yeah, and you mentioned that briefly earlier, but a lot of firms actually have kind of things that they think you should be doing at certain times. And that, a lot of them have a list. And part of your professional development is that, if you're a litigator, you're essentially going down that list every year and saying, well, have you defended a deposition? Have you taken a deposition? What have you done? And so, I think people should try to have access to something like that and see if you're hitting those different milestones. Because if not, when you look to lateral, people are going to ask you these questions. And it's like, well, how are you a fourth year and you've never defended a deposition, like as a litigator? That doesn't make sense.
Yeah, and I would say that those things can sometimes sort of snowball because like you haven't done it and everyone thinks you've done it, and then you're sort of hiding that you haven't done it. So try to catch that early, because I did notice there were some people who were way too senior to have never done a depo, and they sort of didn't know what to do about it, and they were kind of faking it.
Right. And it's hard if you're that person that like everybody just kind of like thinks, oh yeah, I'm sure they've done that, and then you haven't. And then you don't know how, and like you haven't been trained on it, it's one of those things you often just get thrown into at some point. I mean, I remember they just basically told me to go defend some deposition. I'm like, I don't know how to do that. Like, well, here's a book. Actually, I think I was taking part of the deposition. I was like, I don't know how to take a deposition. I never took like trial advocacy. And they're like, well, you've got a cross-country flight. Read this book about it. And it wasn't a big deal. I mean, it was a huge like joint defense group. I asked like 5 questions, but at least I could say like, yes, I've taken a deposition.
And I think we've talked about this before, but pro bono can be, a good opportunity to get that kind of experience.
Oh, definitely. Yeah. So I think you've got to kind of think creatively and kind of try to understand, what people would be looking for in terms of, your career development when they think about hiring you a few years down the road. Because you don't want to just be like, well, all I've done is document review. That's not going to get you very far.
Exactly. Also, I would say, though, be careful that you're not overselling what you've done.
Right.
Because I've seen that also. And one, people don't necessarily believe it. And so you don't look honest. And then 2, you don't want to end up in a situation where you're way over your head.
Right. Yeah. You definitely have to be careful. And hopefully the firm, wherever you're working, has training opportunities too. And so that's also a valid way to say, like, I haven't personally done this, but I did this week-long, trial scenario where we practice all of these things. It's like, okay, cool. That's better than nothing. And like, don't lie about it.
Exactly. And generally, most people at certain levels are going to have done similar things. Like, again, there's outliers, but generally it sort of works out.
Right. All right. Well, any final thoughts on this topic?
Just that this is something I think I've said before, but that you should think about early. And I just feel like isn't told to associates soon enough. And, that they're not necessarily being prepared for the, future. And so you're the only one who can kind of, take control of your career. And so just know that at some point you are going to lateral. And I would think about it sooner rather than later.
Right. Because even if you end up being a partner, I mean, maybe you still want to lateral at some point to be like a better partner. People are always looking to upgrade. So.
Exactly. I think being a partner used to be sort of a lifelong position back in the day, and it's not like that anymore.
Right. People are always looking for that next step. And, the reality is a lot of people move in and out of places too, so if you are someone who's in a law firm and maybe you go in-house to work for a particular government, and then that government changes, you might then go back to a law firm as a partner, these kind of things. People are often moving back and forth in ways that I think, aren't necessarily that transparent.
Absolutely.
All right. Well, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Our pleasure. With that, we are out of time. For more career help and the opportunity to work one-on-one with us, you can check out careerdicta.com. If you enjoyed this episode of the Law School Toolbox podcast, please take a second to leave a review and rating on your favorite listening app. We would really appreciate it. And be sure to subscribe so you don't miss anything. If you have any questions or comments, please don't hesitate to reach out to Lee or Alison at lee@lawschooltoolbox.com or allison@lawschooltoolbox.com, or you can always contact us via our website contact form at lawschooltoolbox.com. Thanks for listening, and we'll talk soon.